The Human Rights Watch, or Human Rights Watch, has slammed what it terms selective government outrage in the ongoing wars impacting human rights. In its latest annual report, the organization says governments around the world are selective in their condemnation of conflict. Among the conflicts the report touches on are those between Israel and Gaza, Russia and Ukraine, as well as Myanmar and Sudan. We take a look at this with Laetitia, Human Rights Watch Africa Deputy Director. Laetitia, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And so we are premising the conversation on the World Report 2023, which looked at some 100 countries when it comes to human rights. What are human rights? Or what is that term, human rights?
I mean, it's a body of international standards which governments across the world for decades now have agreed to uphold. So there isn't a sort of court of law which ensures that these laws are enforced. There are obviously many domestic laws which have been implemented in countries throughout the world to ensure that human rights are being domestically included in jurisdictions, but the international body per se is that there isn't a sort of court of international human rights per se. Now, why then are the messaging and the points we are raising in our World Report, looking at the events of last year, is so important, is that it is up to the international community and to international and individual governments to ensure that part of their diplomacy and actions amongst states are ensuring the enforcement of these standards which the world has agreed upon.
This body of international standards, you take a look at human rights in a number of African countries. I think from your report, we counted over 20 countries on the continent. And so when you are concerned about what you are essentially calling exceptionalism in condemnation of conflict, or rather the abuse of human rights in certain spaces, what essentially are you saying?
I mean, I think the events in the Horn of Africa, not just in 2023, but going back to 2021, exemplify and illustrate very clearly the double standards we are seeing in the world. Now, I mean, if we look in some ways at the international reaction more broadly to the events in Ukraine, this was happening at a time where widespread violations, not only of international human rights law, but international, the laws of war were being violated as Ukraine was breaking out in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia and other regions of northern Ethiopia. And we saw again and again resistance on the part of states on the continent to condemn or to take action to ensure that the abuses which were taking place by the federal government forces of Ethiopia, by Eritrean federal government forces, and also by Amhara regional forces and the Tigrayan forces were being condemned, and action was being taken to stop those violations. And we even saw that at the level of the international community response to those violations. There was immediate response, condemnation, action to ensure investigations into what was happening in Ukraine. And we didn't see that sort of concerted effort when it came to the events in Ethiopia. So it really sent out this message that certain victims deserve to see justice, certain victims' stories deserve to be heard more than others. Now, move forward to last year, where we saw horrific conflict breaking out in Sudan. Again, on the continent, we haven't seen the sort of condemnation, the sort of actions which are needed to protect civilians. Maybe let's look at Darfur. We've been very focused over the last year on events in West Darfur state in particular. Now, this was a region which was very much affected by the horrific events of 20 years ago. We had seen some very important, at the time, AU action to ensure investigations, to ensure high-level scrutiny of events in Darfur. Now, over the last year, we have documented ethnically targeted killings, predominantly of ethnic Masalit populations in West Darfur, ethnically targeted sexual violence, massive physical destruction. We've been seeing villages burnt, towns burnt, and we've seen up to 450,000 people, this is 500,000 people displaced just from West Darfur state into eastern Chad. Where has the condemnation been? At the level of the Security Council, we haven't even seen condemnation of what is an existing arms embargo on Darfur, despite these events. We haven't seen the sort of action around targeted sanctions against the leaders of the Rapid Support Forces who are responsible. It's been the Rapid Support Forces and the allied militia who have been carrying out these waves of atrocities in West Darfur. So they haven't only happened once, they have happened repeatedly as late as last November. And at the same time, in terms of what has happened on Sudan, we've seen a lot of time spent discussing process, where things will happen, but we've really not seen the sort of action which would need to be taken to end attacks on civilian, to place protection of civilian at the center of these discussions, and to hold the two warring parties and their leaders really to account for the abuses not only of the last year, but abuses going back to when they conducted a military coup in October 2021.
Laetitia, when you speak of action that needs to be taken, you also think of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been unstable for decades now. And so when you speak of certain victims deserving justice more than others, it would appear, since the condemnation is selective and that justice is selective, just the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo on the African continent is example enough of that. And so when you speak of action that needs to be taken, is it a matter of justice being selective or others mattering more than others, or is it also complicated by the fact that there's money involved here? Because war is a lucrative business. Instability is quite lucrative, maybe not for the people on the ground, but for those who benefit from it. And so when you take, maybe for the African continent, I can speak for that, when you take at the economic factors that drive instability, who takes the action on behalf of the people on the ground whose human rights are violated every single time, every single day?
Absolutely, and I think many of the factors which you have laid out play into decisions over where the political fight, capital, diplomacy actually goes and the effort goes. I mean, I think the economic angle is critical. Coming back, obviously, to the Horn of Africa, we are not only talking about domestic parties who are involved. There is now well-documented involvement by the media of the involvement of the United Arab Emirates in support of the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. Similarly, we have seen support from Egypt. So we are talking about geopolitical interests, economic interests, which are feeding into the decisions also of actors on the continent, states on the continent, but also Western states in terms of how much they're willing to push, how much they're willing to prioritize ending a conflict, ensuring humanitarian access, ensuring accountability in different conflict areas on the continent. I've been speaking a lot about the Horn, but as we know, I mean, the Sahel is very, very, very much neglected. More broadly, I would say, not only by the diplomatic community, but also by the media. This is really something which has fallen off the agenda despite the years of abuses and suffering and the worsening situation in many of the countries of the Sahel. Take Burundi. Burundi, another country where, again, has completely fallen off many countries' agenda. And again, I think it's important to underscore the role of South Africa in many of these situations, whether it's the human rights context in Burundi, whether it's also involvement in the past on seeking to end abuses in Darfur. South Africa has in the past played a critical role, and we've not been seeing it play that role, whether it's at the level of the Peace and Security or the AU, whether it's at the level of the Human Rights Council, where South Africa is a key player of the African group in the Council in Geneva. We've actually seen time and again South Africa, amongst other African states, being reluctant to see and to ensure the sort of international scrutiny and investigations on country-specific situations. And this is devastating. I mean, again, let's take Sudan. Many Sudanese groups were calling for a mechanism to be established from the early days of the conflict in Sudan. And unfortunately, in many ways, it took the UK to really lead an effort around September, October for such a mechanism to be established. South Africa has a key role at the level of the Human Rights Council to play to ensure that the countries, the conflicts on the continent which should be scrutinized receive the same sort of attention that it's seeking right now to ensure that the Israel-Palestine context receives, for example. And so
sure.
I think...
Laetitia, unfortunately, I do beg your pardon if you'd allow me to join you there. If one were to search for a reason why, to your assertion or your argument that South Africa is not playing enough of a role on the continent. So your report, your 2023 report on South Africa, because South Africa features in the report of these 100 countries, the first paragraph reads, South Africa struggled to realize economic and social rights due to increasing inequality and unemployment exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and corruption. So perhaps we have a number of issues that we are contending with, but of particular interest when it comes to the report on South Africa, you delved into right to a healthy environment, rule of law, police conduct, women's rights, and so it goes. But on rule of law, you focused on one man to capture South Africa's rule of law, and that's the former President Jacob Zuma. You speak of his corruption trial having suffered subsequent delays, one of the reasons you go into it, but the rule of law in South Africa is put down to one man. No one man has all that power. Why does rule of law hinge on Jacob Zuma in South Africa and his corruption trial?
Well, I mean, maybe not to speak to South Africa more specifically, but I think more broadly we actually have seen in terms of responses, in terms of willingness to uphold rule of law, willingness to stand by human rights and the protection of civilians and international humanitarian law on the continent has often been an individualized decision. And I think, again, this is where it is so critical, and a lot of our work obviously on the continent looks at space for civic society and civil society and the media, and concerns we have in many countries about that shrinking space, is that it is critical for institutions to be making decisions. And, you know, again, why does an individualized approach to these questions pose a problem? Is that a lot of the decisions are made are basically about an individual not wanting to get in the bad books of a neighboring president or prime minister because of political ambitions or future, or obviously also concerns around accountability. I mean, I think this is central to a lot of the very weak responses we've seen specifically in neighboring countries to some of the conflicts which have been happening in recent years on the continent, is obviously a bad domestic record, concerns for accountability an individual might face. And so this is a broader picture, and I think what is absolutely critical, and where, you know, what our work also tries to do is ensure that the institutions that are in place to uphold the rule of law are empowered to do so, because I think the impacts are obviously enormous on individuals, on communities at the domestic level, but they also play out in terms of regional, geopolitical, continent-wide decision making.
Laetitia Bader, Africa Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.